Thomas Jefferson famously said, "The government that governs least governs best." And our government is enormous. Do you realize that there's over 200,000 pages of government regulations governing business and our day-to-day lives? 200,000 pages. And these are almost all written in convoluted legalese language, written by lawyers in the agencies, and that legalese language is so difficult that most Americans can't understand what these regulations say. And therefore, how can they know what they're being asked to do by these regulations? How can they know what they're being asked to conform to? And so it creates a level of uncertainty that is just intolerable, especially for business. Now, what can we do about this? Well, first of all, we could create an oversight committee, an oversight group, and it's going to be a pretty large group, of non-lawyers and lawyers to review the language of every new regulation and reject the legalese and go back to plain English. Every single administration for the last 5 or 10 administrations have instructed their agencies to write everything in plain English, and yet it never gets done. We need an organization that will be the gatekeeper and say, "I'm sorry, we can't issue this regulation because it's not in plain English." Second thing we can do is limit regulations to 50 double-spaced pages or less. If you can't write the regulation in less than 50 double-spaced pages, it ought to be reviewed by Congress and either passed as a law or completely rejected. 50 double-spaced pages, my God, the Constitution's only about 14 pages. So let's limit this to 50 pages that people can really digest. Next, let's sunset these 200,000 pages of regulations. Let's make them all sunset after some number of years. Let's say 5 years from the date they were issued, a new regulation would sunset. We would immediately review these 200,000 pages of regulations and probably sunset 90% of it. And then Congress would have to decide whether or not, upon sunsetting, whether or not we would let that regulation die forever or reenact a new, more modern regulation that is more responsive to the needs of the nation and the economy, and more responsive to the need of people to understand what the darn thing says. So the sunsetting of regulations is extremely important. Now, every one of these agencies also issues permits. And that permit is a license that a business needs to do this or that with their business, or a license to do this or that with your nonprofit organization, whatever. Our U.S. government agencies and state agencies are all vastly behind in issuing permits. Recently, the governor of Pennsylvania signed a new law that said that the state agencies of the state of Pennsylvania cannot collect permit fees unless and until they issue a permit. Now, they had tens of thousands of permits in their backlog. Within weeks, 98% of that backlog was cleared. Suddenly, everybody got their permit. Suddenly, everybody could go ahead with their business. Suddenly, the uncertainty of the permitting process was wiped away. Now, there's a lesson there for the federal government. Again, we see lessons in the states all the time. There's a classic lesson there for the federal government to pay attention to, where we can run this thing better, smarter, and more efficiently, and everybody else will have a better economy, a better chance at prosperity in the American dream. Every economist will tell you that 2 necessary ingredients for a growing economy are increasing productivity and a growing population. Every economist knows this. Let's talk about increasing productivity. The number one thing we can do to increase productivity in our economy is stop taxing productivity. And our current tax system is an enormous tax on productivity. The income tax system is, by its very nature, a tax on productivity. Now, in our third episode, we talked about the tax reform that we would recommend to fix this problem and unlock enormous productivity in the United States economy. And again, we talked about three key things. One, a $50,000 exemption, replacing all deductions and exemptions, growing over 10 years to $100,000 per taxpayer. Second, a consumption tax on luxury goods and services. And third, we eliminate the horrible corporate income tax, which is a double or triple tax on our economy that's always passed through to the consumer, the shareholder, the employee, and it is a destructive tax on productivity. We eliminate that. Now, we've already seen an example of how successful that can be in that in the Trump administration, they reduced the corporate income tax from the highest in the world to 20%. Tons of business flowed back into the United States from abroad upon that reduction. And now we're talking about whether or not we're going to keep that tax at 20% in the new Congress, or maybe reduce it to 15. I argue it should go to zero. There's absolutely no economic reason to keep that tax. Yeah, it generates a small amount of money, some amount of money. It generates about 4% of the total budget after we give back a lot of it. But that 4% pales in what we would generate in new economic activity if we eliminated that tax. Now, again, on your screen is the link to our previous episode where we talked about this in detail and discussed all the rationales for why these things make sense, and they make a lot of sense. There's a lot of common sense in this. I urge you to go back and review that. If you haven't seen it before, take a look at it. Another change that government can make is to review, reorganize, and streamline the patent office. Right now, it takes the patent office over 20 months to respond to a patent applicant, just to tell them that we acknowledge we've received your application and it's in process. Over 20 months. Now, only the richest and the best heeled organizations can really withstand that kind of delay. The patent office needs to be revised so that the average person can submit a patent and find out, one, does this patent have any chance, or is it going to be rejected immediately? And if it does have a chance, they need to be encouraged. This would be a tremendous boost to the productivity, not just of corporations, but individuals who have small businesses, who have ideas to improve in business. The patent office is critical to that. And should be an easy fix. And it's something that we haven't looked at in tens of years. So it should be something that we could fix and improve dramatically. Government is also in a unique position to provide the nation and the economy with projects that are so large that no entity, private entity, or combination of private entities could undertake. And the history is full of these kinds of projects that were tremendously successful. The Erie Canal caused an explosion of economic activity in the Northeast and largely created the explosion of growth that creates the island of Manhattan and the shipping that goes through there. The Transcontinental Railroad, the licensing of telegraph lines along the right-of-way of the Transcontinental Railroad to create a communication system that we didn't have before. The Hoover Dam, which lit up the entire southeastern United States and most of Southern California. Very important to economic growth. The interstate highway system, brought in by Dwight Eisenhower, inspired by the German Autobahn, a tremendous increase in productivity from that. These were all tremendous projects. And yet they all pale in comparison to NASA. The challenge of Kennedy to go to the moon before the end of the decade and the subsequent NASA projects have been the single most productive major projects in the world. Endless scientific achievements have come out of the NASA programs. Research on medicine has come from the NASA programs. Countless companies have been spawned by scientific ideas and achievements from the NASA programs, and literally hundreds of thousands of very high-paying jobs have come from the NASA programs, not to mention dramatic enhancements in our national defense. Nothing has done what NASA has done. We have this long list. I mean, I can't even take enough time to touch all the projects that have been so successful, but nothing can compete with what NASA has achieved in terms of increasing the productivity of the United States and of its citizens. And this is the kind of thing that government can be really good at. And this is the kind of thing that government should continue to look for. And I wouldn't hesitate to give more funding to NASA, and in turn, take the ideas of NASA and turn it to looking inward at the oceans. And what can we do of a NASA quality to explore and enhance the oceans? And what will that spawn in terms of productivity? Can you imagine the benefits we'd get just in the fishing industry to better understand ocean currents and, why fish go where they go? I mean, that's just one example. And of course, spinning off from NASA is our space defense. Trump created the so-called Space Force. It didn't exist before him, and I'm not a fan of Trump, but the Space Force is going to be a necessary part of our national defense. And frankly, the undersea defense of our nation is equally as important. So there's examples where a government can be the sponsor of projects that can dramatically enhance the productivity of our nation. But productivity is only half the issue. The other half is increasing our population. Now, there are nations in the world that are having a real problem with declining population. Russia, China, almost every communist country has great difficulty with a declining population, leaving the working part of their economy to support an ever larger group of older people. I mean, it just doesn't work. And it's pretty obvious that China's economy is going to begin to fall apart in the next 15 or 20 years because of this demographic problem. We, on the other hand, have benefited from a growing population. Why? Because so many people want to come to the United States. And the crisis at the southern border is illustrative of that. And as we talked about, we've got to turn that crisis into an opportunity. And I've already talked about the ways that we would do that. Yes, we got to create a wall and guard it, but we've got to expand the State Department facilities in the other countries and then create incentives for people to come here to fill jobs, go to work, and eventually become citizens. And that will be a tremendous benefit to our economy. Why Congress has not fixed this? Everybody in Congress knows about this problem. Everybody in Congress knows that the immigration system is broken. Why the executive branch and Congress have not gotten their act together to fix this is beyond my understanding. I know it's a function of partisan politics, but we have got to fix this problem. And we've already touched on how to do this in our episode number 2. I urge you to go back to episode number 2 and look at that again. Now, the fourth issue that we want to talk about is fiscal responsibility. Our government currently has a national debt. We have a national debt of about $34 trillion, and it's growing very fast. In 2017, that was $17 trillion. So it's doubled in 7 years. That took 200 and some years to get to $17 trillion. And it's now about 125% of the size of our whole economy. Now, for nations that are weaker than we are, that condition would be a recipe for economic disaster. If you're Italy and your national debt is 125% of your economy, you're going down the tubes. We have not done that because A, our US dollar is the benchmark currency of the world, and B, until the last couple of years, interest rates have been damn near zero. And we've gotten away with this debt. But now that interest rates are so high and our debt is so high, the interest on our debt is greater than our defense budget. And that is forcing us to make some decisions and to make some compromises that we really would rather not have to make. And we are going to be compromising on our national security because of this. And this is intolerable. Our government needs to balance the budget, and it needs to balance it in a way that will begin to reduce our national debt. And this is an imperative. This is an existential issue for us. And we need that kind of fiscal responsibility to do that. Now, we will talk in the next episode, we're going to talk about constitutional amendments that would dramatically improve our ability to balance the budget and to deal with the debt. But suffice it to say that this is a complicated issue, and it will take an entire episode to discuss that. A second aspect of fiscal responsibility that results from our having this enormous debt is that there are people in the Congress who want to pressure the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates and say, well, yeah, the debt's high, but if interest rates were lower, we could live with it. And so they want to put pressure on the Federal Reserve to do that. The Federal Reserve must remain independent from the executive and the legislative branch. If it is not independent, then the nation as a whole, and the economy in particular, will not have any confidence in monetary policy, resulting interest rates, and the economy will suffer tremendously because of that. So the Fed has got to keep its hands, the federal government has got to keep its hands off the Fed. The other thing that the federal government must not do is to pick winners and losers. The government is notorious for saying, oh, well, we want to help spawn this industry or that industry, or we don't want to have this industry anymore, so we're going to do this or that. The state of California has said that they're going to ban the sale of gasoline after the year 2035 in an effort to have no more internal combustion engine cars in favor of electric vehicles. Now look, I'm as anxious as anybody to protect the environment and to deal with climate change, but that is the wrong way for government to go about it. We have a long list of United States government loans and guarantees that have gone to companies that have almost immediately gone bankrupt. We have a long list of government incentives that have gone for things that really never made any sense in the first place. Now, I'll tell you one that a lot of people find dear to their heart, and that's the production of ethanol and mixing it with gasoline. Well, I know it helps the corn farmers, but we spend more energy to make ethanol than ethanol produces when it's burned for gasoline or anything else. And we're burning food to make ethanol. It makes no sense. And there are better ways to help the farmers than with that. We also have situations where government has tried to support industries that are doomed. Now, there is a concept in economics called destructive creation, where a part of an economy, an industry, a company is destroyed by the creative activities of another part of the economy. Obviously, think buggy whips, okay? The car came along and then nobody needed a buggy whip anymore and that industry died. But also think about how the telephone industry has evolved. I remember as a child, I remember going to a feed store in a tiny little community in southern Illinois where the only telephone was a wooden box on the wall that you had to crank and you spoke to Central. I mean, I was maybe 5 or 6 years old. And I remember my grandmother using a phone in her house and speaking to Central to be connected to the bank or whatever. And then we had a time when people had radios, but they didn't have telephones in their homes. Then everybody had a rotary telephone. Now nobody has a rotary telephone. They don't even have landlines, but they may have 3 or 4 cell phones in their household. This is an example of creative destruction and how technology has caused industry to evolve. Government must allow that to happen. Government must not step in and try to say, gosh, we've got to save the coal industry. And so we're going to do something, I'm making an egregious example out of this, but we can't do that. We need to let the economy evolve, especially in response to changes in technology. We can't be picking winners and losers. There are times when government has to go into deficit spending. Certainly we did that during World War II. We did it in response to the pandemic. And there are other times we need to anticipate with something called scenario planning, conditions whereby the government, the nation, is beset by many calamities at once, in which case we might be forced to go to deficit spending. Now, right now, we don't have the luxury of deficit spending, frankly, because we are so deeply in debt right now. We need to balance the budget. But we need to balance that budget with the prospect of needing to go to deficit spending in some time in the future when we might be hit with hurricanes on the Gulf Coast in Florida, earthquakes in California, floods in the Midwest, a terrorist attack on New York, a crushing attack on the southern border by immigrants. Imagine a host of calamities all at once, which would require a tremendous government response. We're not ready and equipped for that. But we must get ready for that, and that means we need to balance the budget, get our house in order, and get ready for a scenario in which we respond to all of these calamities. Now, there are instructions for the federal government in what the states have done. We talked a moment ago about what Pennsylvania did to solve their permitting problem and enhance productivity in the state of Pennsylvania. The states, each of the 50 states, is an economic laboratory for economic policy and economic decisions that the federal government can look at to see what works and what doesn't. This book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of States, written by economists Laffer, Moore, Sinquefield, and Brown, is a tremendous book, a statistical analysis of why states did better or worse. And it explains how taxes, energy, and worker freedom make all the difference in the world in the performance of a state economy. Now, this is a book that I think every member of Congress should read, that the government should follow, and they should use this knowledge to look at how the states are performing, to get better ideas for how to manage the economy. It works. It really works. And we could have, again, I talked about how there's no reason our economy can't grow at 6% a year. This proves it. And there's no reason that we shouldn't grow that fast. And if we did, everything is easier. The debt problem is easier. The Social Security problem is easier. The Medicare, Medicaid problem is easier. It's easier for all of us to achieve our American dream. This proves that we can grow faster. There's statistical analysis of all of the states' economic performance and statistical analysis aimed at diagnosing why certain states perform better than others when isolating on three key elements: worker freedom, taxes, and energy. Those were three key elements that were common to all of the states that were performing better than others. Energy is integral to everything we do, not just the economy, but when you go home at night and you throw the switch, it's dark outside, and you throw the switch in the kitchen, the light comes on. That's an example. Now, if you've lived in India, you can go home at night and throw the switch and nothing happens. Same is true in rural China, where you just can't rely on energy. And that means businesses can't function. That means jobs are not created or jobs are destroyed. Cheap energy, we are blessed in this country with incredibly cheap energy. For the most part, gasoline costs less than bottled water, for crying out loud. And our energy costs to run a home are relatively low vis-a-vis that of, say, Western Europe and so on. So energy is crucial. Texas, for example, has an abundance of fossil fuel energy, but it's also the nation's capital for wind energy. And just this last year, it's become the nation's capital for solar energy. Just a tremendous benefit to the economy from those three sources of energy. And we have worker freedom. In some states, workers cannot go from factory to factory the way they can, say, in Texas, which is a right-to-work state. In some states, you can't go from job to job within the factory because of a union limitation. Texas is a right-to-work state, so we don't have that problem. Texas also has no income tax, no inheritance tax, no capital gains tax. In contrast to, say, the state of New York, which has enormous taxes, California, which has enormous taxes. So these are three critical areas that I cite. They are cited in detail in the book, An Inquiry into the Wealth of States, which is a takeoff on The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. So this is a phenomenal book, and it's an example of what government can do to study that which works and that which doesn't work. And the states are 50 economic laboratories for doing that. Now, the last thing I would say as to what government can do to support the economy and to support us is that government must tell the truth. I know this sounds corny, but we have numerous examples in the last year where government has lied to us. Government officials have lied to us. It's been exposed. We have former government officials lying to us. And we have candidates running for office all the time telling us lies and thinking that we're going to swallow it. Well, when government officials, when candidates lie to us, it shakes our confidence in government and in our institutions. Confidence in our economy, confidence in our nation, confidence in government and its institutions are critical to the overall performance of the economy. Government needs to tell the truth, not just for the economy, but because it's the right thing to do. And I cannot emphasize enough how important that is. And it needs to tell the truth at all levels of government. I get that there are certain national secrets that have to be protected. I'm not arguing that point. But by and large, government needs to tell the truth. Tell the truth about statistics, tell the truth about the policies, tell the truth about what is happening around us, tell the truth about our threats. So this concludes the fourth episode of Common Sense for America, where we focus on the American economy and how our four principles of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and self-reliance are supported by the economy and in turn how they support the economy. I hope you will join us next time when we are going to talk about constitutional amendments aimed at enhancing our individual liberty, enhancing our ability to pursue happiness, and improving our safety. All of those things will be discussed in our next episode on constitutional amendments. I hope you'll join us. In the meantime, God bless you and God bless America.